The fluorescent lights hummed their sterile song as Laura Bennett pushed through the ER entrance at 11:22 p.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that hung loose enough to hide what they needed to hide. 8 months. 172 nights at St. Michael's in Denver, and not a single person had asked her name beyond the roster. That was exactly the point. The night shift smelled like antiseptic and resignation, that particular blend of bleach and burnt coffee that only existed after midnight in a hospital. Her locker was in the back corridor, third from the end, behind a nurse's station where the charting screens glowed with the steady stream of waiting patients. She changed with the ritualistic precision of someone who had done it in tents, in trucks, in supply closets with rounds still echoing outside. Her fingers found the inside of her jacket lining before she pulled on her scrubs, feeling for the faded patch sewn there 3 months ago when the isolation started to bite. Baghdad Forward Surgical Team. Call sign, Valkyrie. Nobody here knew that name. Nobody here would ever need to. Dr. Marcus Pierce was already in the medication room when she arrived to verify the pharmacy log. He didn't look up from the four-cart he was organizing, a display of competence that existed purely for the observation of others. Everything about him moved like money. The watch on his wrist cost more than Laura's monthly rent, his shoes were polished enough to see your doubt in them, and his voice carried the particular timbre of a man who had never been told no. He had made it his personal mission to destroy her, though Laura suspected he wouldn't have framed it that way. He would have called it maintaining standards. Protecting hierarchy. Keeping nurses in their lane. Your charting from last night was flagrant, he said, still not looking at her. The words floated out like he was commenting on the weather. Page 47. You documented a patient's mental status assessment without requesting physician evaluation first. That's scope creep, Bennett. She didn't correct him. Didn't point out that she had charted observations, not assessment, a distinction that mattered in 3 different regulatory frameworks. Didn't mention that the patient had been in acute distress and the physician was 40 minutes away. The silence was a skill. The silence was a weapon she had learned to sharpen in places where the cost of speaking was measured in blood. I understand, doctor, she said quietly. Her voice was supposed to be small. Supposed to apologize before anyone asked her to. Supposed to make herself smaller with each passing hour. He did look at her then, and something flickered across his face, a strange, frustrated anger at the very fact that she had accepted his criticism without defense. His jaw tightened the way it always did when he couldn't provoke her. When he couldn't crack the surface. She had learned early on that Dr. Pierce needed an audience for his authority to feel real. Compliance wasn't enough. He needed resistance. He needed tears. He needed her to diminish herself verbally while he watched. Move faster on your rounds, he said, turning back to his inventory. You're inefficient. I've noticed it. Others have noticed it. She nodded once and turned to leave, but his voice cut through before she reached the door. And stop with the for starts. That's not your job anymore. Call me next time. I don't care if it takes 40 minutes. The thing about invisible strength is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require an audience. Laura had held a surgeon's hand steady during a compound fracture repair while incoming fire painted the tent walls. She had run a field triage station where one wrong decision meant someone's daughter didn't come home. She had started falls by feel alone in darkness, knowing that the light would draw sniper fire. Dr. Pierce watched her hands move with that same surgical precision when she threaded a needle, when she accessed a port, when she steadied a patient's arm through the tremor of morphine withdrawal. His hands didn't move like that. His hands moved like he had learned medicine from a textbook and stayed there. But that was the problem, wasn't it? That was exactly what made him dangerous. The trauma alert came through at 12:34 a.m. Incoming. Marine casualty. Direct admission from Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center. ETA 20 minutes. Laura's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. The fluorescent light suddenly felt too bright, too close, as if they were pressing down on her skull. She set the cup down with deliberate precision and looked at the screen where the admitting information was starting to populate. Sergeant Major Chen. Third-degree lacerations, right shoulder, compound fracture radius and ulna, extensive soft tissue damage from IED blast radius assessment. Transferred for surgical reconstruction. She had worked with Chen in Fallujah. Not worked with him. Under him. He had taken command of her unit after her retirement, the retirement that wasn't actually a retirement but rather a reassignment so classified that her mother still thought she had left the Marines due to a shoulder injury. Chen was the best medic she had ever seen outside of an operating theater. Steady hands. Steady mind. The kind of presence that kept people from bleeding out through sheer force of competence and will. The kind of presence that Dr. Pierce would immediately recognize as a threat to his authority. Trauma Bay 2 is prepped, called out Maria, one of the senior nurses, glancing toward Laura. We're good for arrival. 20 minutes, Laura confirmed. Her voice was still small. Still deferential. Still didn't belong to anyone who had ever been in a forward surgical team. I'll get the surgical packs ready. The vending machine at 1:15 a.m. was a fluorescent-lit island of solitude on the third floor. Laura had chosen this location deliberately, far enough from the action that conversations wouldn't carry, visible enough that walking here felt ordinary. She was feeding coins into the slot when two nurses rounded the corner. Emily and Patricia. Both had been friendly for the first 4 months of Laura's tenure. Both had slowly migrated to the other side of the nurses' station after Dr. Pierce made his opinions known. That's the Bennett woman, one of them whispered, Emily, the one with the dyed blonde streak. Playing doctor again. Did you see how she was looking at the trauma alert? Patricia's voice carried the particular venom of someone trying on meanness for the first time and finding it fit. Like she thought she was going to actually do something. Just because you can Google anatomy doesn't mean you're a surgeon. The phrase hung in the vending machine's hum like cigarette smoke. Laura's hand was still on the coin slot. Her coffee selection glowed in the machine. She could have left then. Could have chosen the invisible route, the small route, the route that Dr. Pierce expected and wanted. Instead, she turned around. The silence was so complete that neither nurse seemed to realize she was standing there until it had already become a presence. Laura didn't move. Didn't clench her jaw or flush or shake. She was simply there, and the quality of her stillness had weight. Had density. Her stare was flat and cold in a way that didn't carry emotion, it carried truth. The kind of truth that gets carved into you during trauma, during loss, during nights where the only difference between living and dying was the precision of your hands. Strange, she said, her voice surgical and precise, dropping an octave below what they had heard before. How threatened some people feel by basic competence. She didn't wait for them to respond. Didn't need to. Her coffee arrived with a soft mechanical drop, and she collected it without looking back, her movement steady as a laser, and walked toward the trauma bay while their silence followed like a wake. The doors to Trauma Bay 2 were being wheeled open when she arrived. The gurney rolled through flanked by paramedics calling vitals in staccato bursts. Sergeant Major Chen. Conscious but pale. His right shoulder wrapped in temporary dressing that was already showing through with seepage, not the dark stain of old bleeding but the bright arterial red of active loss. His eyes found her for exactly 1 second as they rolled past. He knew her. Dr. Pierce was already at the bay entrance, his stethoscope positioned around his neck like a necklace, his hands moving to assume the command position he had rehearsed 1,000 times in front of mirrors. Laura moved to the equipment station and began pulling surgical packs with the fluid precision of someone who had done this under mortar fire. I'll take lead on this one, Dr. Pierce announced, his voice pitched for maximum authority. Let's get 2 large bore fours running. Lab work stat. Get him prepped for OR. And someone get me a proper surgical team assembled. The way his eyes slid past her, through her, as he issued orders told Laura everything she needed to know about what was about to happen. Dr. Pierce had seen something in her tonight at the vending machine. Had heard something drop in her voice. And he had decided, in that moment, that she needed to be broken before Sergeant Major Chen asked for her by name. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sergeant Major Chen was lying on that gurney with an arterial bleed that wouldn't hold for more than 4 more minutes, and Dr. Pierce had never actually managed a vessel repair under pressure. Had never had to feel the difference between confidence and competence when someone's life was the currency. And in exactly 8 minutes, when the trauma exceeded his grasp, Laura would have to choose between her undercover assignment, her career with naval intelligence, her careful 8-month invisibility, and the man who had been willing to die to get her back. The conference room at St. Michael's held 30 residents and attending physicians, their white coats creating a pale wall around the long wooden table. Laura stood at the back, her badge clipped to her scrubs, watching Dr. Pierce hold up her chart notes like a prosecution exhibit. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a clinical pallor that made his face look gaunt, predatory. "This," Pierce said, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of credentials, "is what happens when nursing staff forget their place." He turned a page slowly, deliberately. "Nurse Bennett here has documented assessment findings and made clinical observations that suggest she believes herself qualified to practice medicine. Advanced clinical reasoning. Treatment recommendations. This dangerous autonomy puts patients at risk." The residents smirked behind their clipboards. One whispered something to another. Neither bothered to hide it. Laura's face remained completely still. Her eyes were flat and cold as lake ice, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than a man with a title and fragile ego. Her hands hung at her sides, steady as surgical lasers. She watched Pierce like a predator watches a competitor in its territory. "Perhaps the Girl Scout here needs remedial training on scope of practice," Pierce continued, emboldened by the laughter rippling through the room. "Or perhaps she'd be more comfortable working at an urgent care clinic. Somewhere her enthusiasm wouldn't endanger patients under my watch." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Laura took one breath. Then she spoke, her voice dropping an octave, each word hitting like a staccato pulse. "Strange how competence without arrogance looks like insubordination to those who have only one of those things." She turned and walked out of the conference room before anyone could respond, her shoulders never tensing, her pace never quickening. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than Pierce's voice had been. The room went dead silent. Pierce's jaw clenched visibly. His fingers crushed the corner of her chart. He'd expected tears, denial, defensive rambling, the classic collapse he'd engineered in 3 other nurses over his 15-year tenure at St. Michael's. Instead, Laura had simply evaporated, leaving him standing in front of 30 witnesses who were now exchanging glances that suggested they'd just watched something unprecedented. One resident actually smiled. Pierce saw it and his face flushed crimson. "Back to work," he snapped. "Unless you'd all like to discuss your own competence gaps." 2 hours later, at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, Laura was reaching for coffee when she heard the voices. Carol and Jennifer, both respiratory therapists who'd worked the night shift for 6 years. Both poisoned by Pierce's carefully planted comments about Laura's instability, her boundary issues, her delusional sense of clinical authority. "That Bennett woman playing doctor again," Carol whispered, loud enough to carry. "Heard she questioned Dr. Pierce's antibiotic choice yesterday. Who does she think she is?" "Total liability," Jennifer agreed. "I heard she documented some kind of assessment finding without even consulting the attending. Like she was running the show." Laura turned to face them. Her stare was so flat and emotionless that both women froze mid-gesture, mid-breath, their bodies locking into uncomfortable stillness. "Go on," Laura said quietly. "I'm listening." Neither could meet her eyes. Carol suddenly became very interested in selecting a snack from the machine. Jennifer turned away, her shoulders hunched. In the silence, you could hear the mechanical hum of the vending machine's compressor, the distant beep of a monitor 3 floors down, the sound of someone's life continuing normally while these 2 women discovered what it felt like to be caught. Laura selected her coffee and left. Behind her, neither woman spoke for a full minute. But that wasn't the worst part. By evening, Pierce had begun his strategic assault. He'd already prepared the weapons, hospital policy, administrative channels, the careful weaponization of bureaucracy that moves slower than any blade but cuts far deeper. He reassigned Laura to lower acuity patients, restricting her access to the critical trauma cases where her skills had begun to shine too brightly. She was transferred from the surgical ICU rotation to general medical surgical floors. Her name was quietly removed from the advanced trauma protocol roster. No official announcement. No explanation. Just the slow suffocation of opportunity, the professional equivalent of exile. He documented everything with surgical precision. Patient safety concerns regarding independent clinical judgment. Noted instances of scope of practice deviation. Built a paper trail so meticulous, so carefully worded in administrative language, that it would look like institutional protection rather than personal vendetta. His lawyer brother-in-law, a man named Sterling who worked in healthcare law, had sent him a template 2 years ago, the architecture of destruction dressed up as policy compliance. Laura watched the reassignments come through without reaction. She simply nodded when her charge nurse told her about the changes, said understood, and continued her shift. Her composure through the humiliation only deepened Pierce's certainty that she was hiding something, that this facade of professionalism masked an imposter's desperate fear of exposure. He didn't yet understand that her calm came not from terror, but from the knowledge that she'd survived things that would destroy him psychologically. She'd held a 17-year-old Marine's intestines in her hands and kept him talking until the medevac arrived. She performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife in a sandstorm because the patient was dying and she was all there was. She'd signed paperwork certifying her retirement from active service knowing it meant becoming invisible, becoming a nurse, becoming exactly this, a ghost moving through the hospital, playing a role, waiting for the moment when she could stop performing and start acting. In the supply closet at midnight, Pierce cornered her near the sterile field supplies. His hands were trembling with the particular rage of a man discovering that humiliation and authority weren't producing the outcome he'd orchestrated so carefully. "I'm watching you, Bennett," he said, his voice tight and vicious. "One mistake. One tiny deviation from protocol. And I'll have your license. You'll never work in medicine again. I'll make sure of it." Laura checked her watch. The gesture was almost contemptuous in its casualness. "Is that all?" she asked. "My patient in 302 needs her meds." She stepped around him, her shoulder brushing his white coat with the kind of contact that made him feel dismissed rather than threatened. Pierce's hands actually shook as he watched her walk away. He pulled out his phone immediately, documenting the confrontational encounter with meticulous detail. He was building his case, layering evidence, preparing the institutional machinery that would eventually grind her down. He had no idea what was about to arrive on a gurney at 0230. The trauma alert came through at exactly 2:28 a.m. Gunshot wound, no, correction, blast injury, Marine in tactical gear, inbound ETA for minutes. Laura was checking 4 lines on a post-op patient when the overhead system crackled to life, and her body went completely rigid for 1 fraction of a second before resuming movement. She finished the medication, finished the assessment, and moved toward the trauma bay like someone walking into a room she'd always known would come. Sergeant Major David Chen arrived on a gurney at 0230, his tactical vest cut away, bandages soaked through with blood the color of rust. His fatigue uniform was caked with desert dust and something darker. The flight medic was calling his vitals in that professional monotone that masked the severity beneath: BP 95/62, heart rate 128, respiratory rate 22, O2 sat 94 on high flow, 2 large bore 4s running normal saline wide open. Laura took the handoff report and froze for a fraction of a second when she saw his face. Marine Sergeant Major David Chen. The medic who'd taken over her surgical unit after her retirement from active service. The man who'd been willing to die doing the exact job she'd once done, running a forward surgical team in the same Baghdad district, same Jolan neighborhood, same blood-soaked concrete she'd left 2 years ago. His eyes were closed, morphine-heavy. He didn't recognize her. Laura's hand trembled once as she hooked up the monitor, tracing the cardiac leads across his chest with the muscle memory of 2,000 training repetitions and 83 combat procedures. Then her hand steadied. She'd made a choice the moment she saw his face. Invisibility was over. Dr. Pierce arrived and immediately shouldered her aside, moving into position with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his own competence. "I'll handle this one personally," he announced. "Marine hero deserves more than basic nursing care." Laura stepped back, positioning herself in the corner, watching the monitors with the eyes of someone who'd read 1,000 cardiac tracings in emergency light and had learned to see what most people missed. Chen's pressure was already dropping, 90/60, then 85/55 as Pierce ordered standard interventions, textbook responses, the kind of medicine that worked perfectly fine until it didn't. Laura saw what Pierce missed entirely. The subtle chest asymmetry. The jugular distension. The muffled heart sounds that suggested blood accumulating in the pericardial sac, pressure building around the heart, compression, collapse. She'd seen this presentation before, twice in the field, once in surgical residency training before the naval intelligence recruitment had redirected her entire life. "Doctor, I think he's developing a," Laura began. "I didn't ask for your medical opinion, Nurse Bennett," Pierce cut her off, his voice sharp enough to silence the entire trauma bay. "Check his for access and nothing more." Laura's jaw tightened once, her fingers finding the unit patch through her jacket lining. That small faded piece of fabric sewn inside her jacket, the only physical reminder of who she actually was, it anchored her. She said nothing, but she didn't leave. At 0255, Chen's pressure dropped to 70/40. Cardiac output was failing. Tissue perfusion collapsing. Pierce ordered more fluids, clearly missing the diagnosis, still operating from the playbook of massive hemorrhage rather than the reality of tension physiology. Laura pulled Chen's chart with movements that looked casual, routine, and wrote a single clinical note in clear, precise language: recommend immediate CT chest, concern for delayed hemothorax. Consider pericardiocentesis if pressors inadequate. She knew Pierce would see it. She knew what it would cost her. Pierce read the note 5 minutes later and his face went purple with a particular shade of rage that only came from the collision of wounded ego and the recognition that someone was right and he was wrong. "My office," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Now." Laura didn't move from Chen's bedside. Her hand was steady on the 4-line, her eyes fixed on the monitor showing his deteriorating rhythm. "After I finish this assessment," she said quietly. Pierce leaned close enough that only she could hear him. His breath smelled like bad coffee and something older, something rotten. "I'm going to destroy you for this." Laura turned to face him, and something in her expression, something that had nothing to do with nursing credentials and everything to do with what happens when someone who's already lost everything is backed into a corner, made him actually step backward. "Doctor," she said, her voice now carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I need you to step back from this patient's bedside. Now." The tone wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the voice of a woman who'd ordered men into impossible situations and brought them back alive. For the first time, Dr. Pierce actually obeyed her. The helicopter touched down at 0230, rotors hammering the air like artillery as 2 flight medics hauled Sergeant Major Chen from the bird. Laura was already moving, her badge clipped to scrubs that hadn't been white since the shift began. The medics handed off in rapid-fire fragments: blast trauma, IED, left flank entry, tamponade held through flight, vitals unstable, field dressing soaked through twice. Chen's tactical vest hung open, cut away by combat medic somewhere over the Rocky Mountains. His chest rose and fell in shallow, fractured breaths. His skin had the color of old concrete. Laura took the stretcher handles without acknowledgement, her eyes cataloging what the flight crew had missed. The entry wound in his ribs, fourth intercostal space. The subtle distension of his abdomen. The way his neck veins stood out like cables. Not acute bleeding, slow bleeding. Delayed bleeding. The kind that had been seeping into his chest cavity for 3 hours while he held it together with sheer Marine discipline, because stopping meant admitting you were dying, and Marines didn't stop. She'd seen this pattern before. Sanjin Valley, October 2009. A squad leader with shrapnel embedded between his ribs, no external hemorrhage, vitals holding at the combat outpost. By the time they reached Kandahar Regional, his blood pressure had begun its collapse. She'd been Captain Bennett then, not a nurse named Laura. She'd opened his chest in the pre-op holding area because there wasn't time for the operating room. "Get him to Trauma 1, she said to the ER staff. 2 units uncrossed, call for thoracic. Now." The diagnostic ultrasound took 40 seconds. Fluid in the pericardium. Fluid layering in the left chest cavity. Chen's blood pressure was holding at 92 systolic, but his heart rate had climbed to 142, a body screaming silently, the way only a trained Marine could. His eyes found hers across the monitors. He recognized her. She saw it happen. His pupils dilated, then refocused with absolute clarity, because he knew what this meant and he knew what she'd done before. At 0300, his blood pressure dropped to 60/30. The monitors shrieked. The oxygen sat plummeted from 98 to 84 in 4 seconds. Chen's chest heaved once, twice, and then his body betrayed him. The slow bleed had become a cascading hemorrhage. His sternum was caving in. His lungs were drowning. Dr. Pierce stood at the curtain, watching the screens, his hands hanging at his sides. 3 seconds passed. 3 seconds while Chen's O2 fell to 76, while his heart rate climbed past 160, while his pupils dilated with the specific clarity of a man whose brain was starving for oxygen. Pierce's mouth opened. No words came. The textbook knowledge that had made him department chief suddenly meant nothing in the presence of active death. Laura was already moving. The crash cart was 6 steps away. She grabbed the scalpel, not the surgical blade from the tray, the actual trauma scalpel, the one designed for field procedures when there was no time for sterility, no time for anything except the physics of blood and pressure and the mathematics of survival. She'd used one exactly like it in a sandstorm tent outside Fallujah, her hand steady as laser guidance while artillery thundered outside the canvas walls. She tore open Chen's gown. The surgical site was already marked by the field dressing from Baghdad, the edges stark and clinical against his skin. She didn't hesitate. Muscle memory was 10,000 repetitions, and her muscles remembered everything. The scalpel found the 4th intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the precise anatomical reference points that lived in her hands more than her mind. The blade went in with the sound of fabric tearing, not his ribs yet, just the fascia, the intercostal muscles. Blood sprayed across her scrubs like a blessing. She made the 2nd incision. Her fingers entered the chest cavity, and the warmth of it was like returning to something she'd never left. The bleeding site was anterior mediastinal, right where she'd suspected. The descending aorta had been nicked by shrapnel fragments that had been spending 3 hours slowly perforating, a delayed catastrophe that had waited until he was safe in a hospital to try to kill him. Her fingers found the artery. Found the bleeding point. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had saved 14 Marines in a single night under mortar fire, her mind absolutely silent, her body absolutely present. 1.0 epinephrine, for push, she called out without looking up. Get me type O negative, run it wide open. Thoracic surgery, tell them I've got manual control of the descending aorta and I'm not letting go until they're ready for takeover. A nurse moved. An attending physician moved. The crash cart rolled closer. The vital signs monitor began its slow, impossible climb. 82. 88. 91. Chen's color returned from concrete to something approaching human. The hiss of the rapid infuser pushed blood into his veins at pressure that would have terrified anyone who hadn't spent years understanding that in this moment, there was no gentle. Gentle meant death. Pressure stabilizing, a resident said, his voice shaking. No, it's not, Laura said, her eyes on the arterial bleed, her fingers maintaining pressure on the exact spot where Chen's life was escaping. It's compensating. We buy time until thoracic opens him officially or we lose him in the first 5 minutes of the OR. Blood banks, I need at least 2 more units standing by. She didn't look up when Dr. Pierce arrived. His shoes made a sound against the tile that was louder than the alarms, a sharp, authoritative click that meant someone with position and certainty had entered the room. The air pressure changed. The fluorescent lights above them seemed to hum with sudden voltage, and every person in the trauma bay became aware of his presence the way small animals know when a predator has entered the clearing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Pierce's voice cracked across the room like a snapped branch. Laura's hands didn't move. Her fingers maintained their position on the bleeding site with the precision of someone holding something far more delicate than an artery. "Saving his life," she said. "Call thoracic surgery. Tell them field thoracotomy, descending aorta repair needed in OR. We have maybe 15 minutes before compensation fails. Move." Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. For one moment, his institutional certainty crumbled against the absolute authority of someone who had already made the decision that mattered. Laura had never raised her voice. Her tone had been completely level, completely calm, completely certain, the voice of someone who had performed this procedure under fire, who had done it 11 times, who would do it 11 more if necessary. For the first time, Dr. Pierce actually obeyed her. He was already moving for the phone when the thoracic surgeon arrived. Dr. Patricia Reeves, who had trained at Walter Reed and remembered the wars, who took one look at the surgical site and said 3 words that meant Chen would live: "Let me take over." Laura stepped back, her hands releasing their pressure as Reeves took position. The surgeon's eyes met hers for exactly 1 second, and in that second was a recognition that transcended the scrubs Laura wore, that penetrated the role she'd been performing for 8 months. Reeves knew what she was looking at. "Beautiful work," Reeves said quietly, and her hands took over the artery pressure as they moved Chen toward the operating room. "Whoever trained you right." The bay emptied as they wheeled him out. The monitors went silent. Laura stood with Chen's blood cooling on her scrubs, her hand still remembering the shape of his descending aorta, her mind already shifting to the wreckage that was coming. Dr. Pierce was at the nurse's station, his phone already out, his fingers moving across the screen with mechanical precision. She watched him photograph the empty trauma bay. Photograph the scattered equipment. Photograph the blood-soaked drapes that had once been white. Each image was documentation. Each timestamp was evidence. She could see him typing, "Incident report, violation of nursing scope of practice, unauthorized procedure, immediate termination recommended." He wasn't wrong about the regulations. He was absolutely correct about the violations. And it didn't matter, because Sergeant Major Chen would live, and Laura Bennett had just performed field surgery that required a rank she couldn't admit to having, in a hospital where her actual purpose was intelligence gathering, on behalf of a mission that was now irreversibly compromised. She washed the blood from her hands and arms at the trauma sink, watching the red spiral down the drain, knowing exactly what came next. Naval intelligence was going to call her. The mission was over. Her identity was burned. Dr. Pierce's footsteps echoed down the trauma corridor at 0315, his white coat snapping behind him like a flag of war. He'd been paged emergently, code blue, Trauma Bay 1, and he moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. That confidence lasted exactly 4 seconds after he pushed through the double doors. Laura stood chest-deep in Sergeant Major Chen's thoracic cavity, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times under worse conditions. Her forearms were crimson to the elbows. Blood dripped from her wrists onto the sterile field. The 14-gauge angiocath needle lay discarded on the tray beside her, its work complete. She was clamping the left internal mammary artery with a satin sky clamp, stabilizing the hemorrhage that should have killed him 3 minutes ago. Dr. Pierce went white. Not pale. White like all the blood had drained from his face in a single heartbeat. "What are you doing?" His voice came out strangled, a sound between a question and an accusation. Laura didn't look up. She was focused entirely on the surgical field, on the rupture she was sealing, on the Sergeant Major's oxygen saturation climbing, 64, 71, 78, each number a measurement of success. "Saving his life, Doctor. You are a registered nurse. You cannot." Pierce's hands trembled as he stepped closer, watching her work. Watching her hands move like she'd trained for this. Like she'd done this before. "Step away from that patient. Step away now." The thoracic surgeon, Dr. Yates, appeared in the doorway behind Pierce, taking in the scene with the shock of someone who'd never seen a floor nurse perform an emergency thoracotomy. The O2 sat climbed to 82. Then 89. Then 94. Stable. Laura finally looked up, her eyes meeting Pierce's across the open chest cavity. Her expression was absolutely flat. No apology. No explanation. No emotion at all. Just a woman doing what needed to be done. "Pressure stabilizing," she said calmly. He was exsanguinating. 70 seconds from cardiac arrest. You were still 3 minutes away. Dr. Yates moved into the bay, taking position without a word, assessing Laura's work. His jaw tightened. He nodded once, a gesture that meant, "Good work, hand off." Laura stepped back, her hand still gloved, blood still wet on her arms, and let the thoracic surgeon take the clamp. The transition was seamless. Professional. The work of two highly trained surgeons exchanging control of a crisis they both understood perfectly. Dr. Pierce turned and walked out of the trauma bay without another word. But his silence was worse than shouting. His silence was the sound of someone calculating. Planning. Revenge requires precision, and precision was the only language Dr. Pierce spoke fluently. He went directly to his office on the 3rd floor. The hospital was quiet at 3 in the morning, most of the administrative staff asleep, most of the clinicians focused on their patients. Perfect. He pulled up the electronic health records system and began to type. The first incident report took 17 minutes. Scope of practice violation, RN performing invasive surgical procedure. He documented the date, the time, the specific actions, observed RN Bennett performing emergency thoracotomy using surgical instrumentation without physician supervision or authorization. Patient was already stable following initial resuscitation. Procedure was unnecessary and constituted gross violation of nursing scope of practice per Colorado Board of Nursing Regulations Section 12-255-102, 3A. He cited the regulations precisely. He quoted the hospital's own policy manual, Section 4.7.2, all surgical procedures must be performed by credentialed physicians or surgeons. Nursing staff are prohibited from performing invasive procedures beyond their authorized scope. His documentation was meticulous. Clinical. Devastating. He filed the report in the system and watched it propagate through the hospital's compliance tracking dashboard. Then he began the second form. And the third. And the fourth. By 4 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Pierce had filed 17 separate documents, incident reports, scope of practice violation notices, a formal complaint to the Colorado Board of Nursing, a termination recommendation to hospital HR, and a personal letter to the chief medical officer detailing his serious concerns about patient safety and staff competency. Each form was carefully worded. Each citation was accurate. Each sentence was designed to build an airtight paper trail that would bury her so completely that no one would ever dig her up. The masterwork was his termination recommendation. In it, he detailed not just the thoracotomy, but 8 months of documented insubordination, resistance to standard protocols, and concerning patterns of autonomy inconsistent with her role as nursing staff. He mentioned the chart note she'd written on Chen before the crash. He referenced her refusal to accept reassignment without complaint. He characterized her as a liability, a risk, a threat to patient safety masked by competence that had apparently made her believe she was qualified to perform surgery. Her behavior during the emergency procedure was particularly concerning, he wrote. Rather than alerting a physician immediately upon patient deterioration, she took it upon herself to perform an invasive procedure. This suggests either a fundamental misunderstanding of her role or a deliberate disregard for hospital policy. Either possibility is disqualifying. She should not be allowed to continue employment at St. Michael's Medical Center. He hit send on the termination recommendation at 4:43 a.m. Then he called hospital security and asked them to flag her access badge for administrative review. By the time the sun came up, his paperwork would be waiting in the office of every hospital administrator who mattered. In Trauma Bay 1, the thoracic surgery team worked through the darkness of the night and into the gray light of pre-dawn. 6 hours. 360 minutes. The clock on the wall measured out each second with the quiet tick-tick-tick of institutional time. They repaired the laceration to the left internal mammary artery. They sealed the pneumothorax. They transfused 4 units of packed red blood cells and 2 units of fresh frozen plasma. They closed the thoracic cavity with the meticulous precision of surgeons who understood that this man should have been dead and wasn't. By 6:30 in the morning, Chen's vitals were stable. His blood pressure was 112/68. His oxygen saturation was 98% on room air. He was alive because a woman in scrubs had recognized him in the darkness and understood what needed to be done. He was alive because she hadn't waited for permission. Laura waited in the hallway outside his room, still in blood-soaked scrubs, the adrenaline long gone, replaced by the hollow exhaustion that comes after you've saved someone and know it's about to cost you everything. She'd changed her gloves a dozen times during the procedure. She hadn't changed her shirt. The blood was drying on her arms, flaking away like rust, and she didn't care. At 6:45, a nurse she didn't recognize appeared. "The administration wants to see you. Conference room on the 2nd floor. Now." The walk down the hallway felt like walking toward an execution. She didn't know about the 17 forms. She didn't know about the termination recommendation. She only knew that she'd done the exact thing she'd been trained to do, and that doing it was going to destroy the one mission she'd been given. The conference room was cold. 3 hospital administrators sat on one side of a long table, the chief medical officer, the director of nursing, and the hospital's chief legal officer. Dr. Pierce sat beside them, his face arranged into an expression of professional concern. Security stood by the door. Her security badge hung from her neck like a noose. Ms. Bennett, the chief legal officer, began, sliding a stack of papers across the table toward her. 17 pages. All of them forms. All of them bearing Dr. Pierce's signature. "We need to discuss what happened in Trauma Bay 1 this morning." Laura's jaw tightened. She didn't sit down. She didn't tremble. She didn't ask for a union representative. She did what she always did, she told the truth. The patient was exsanguinating. Blood loss at that rate, for minutes until cardiac arrest. The attending physicians were still 3 minutes out. The procedure was necessary and appropriate. "That's not a nursing judgment to make," the director of nursing said quietly. She looked ashamed. Laura had worked with her for 8 months. They'd had coffee together. They'd talked about their families. "I was operating under Marine Corps combat medical protocols. My training as a surgical officer?" The chief legal officer cut her off. His voice was gentle, which made it worse. "Ms. Bennett, these claims about military training and surgical credentials, combined with your actions this morning. I'm concerned about your mental health. It's concerning that you would fabricate military service to justify performing an unauthorized procedure." Laura felt something shift inside her. It wasn't anger. It was the cold clarity that comes when you understand the exact dimensions of the trap you're standing in. "My nursing position was operational cover. I'm actually a Marine captain. I was placed here by Naval Intelligence to investigate pharmaceutical trafficking. I can provide you with..." "That's enough." The CMO's voice was firm. "We are terminating your employment, effective immediately, for patient safety reasons. Your scope of practice violation this morning has been documented. Your claims about military intelligence assignments are, frankly, alarming. We recommend that you seek psychiatric evaluation." Dr. Pierce didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His face showed barely concealed satisfaction, the look of a man who had systematically destroyed his enemy and was confident no one would ever find the body. A security officer approached her. "We need to collect your badge and walk you to your locker." Laura followed them through the corridors of St. Michael's Medical Center, where she'd worked for 8 months without a single colleague knowing who she really was. The hallway was busy now, or shift change, morning rounds, the hospital coming alive. Nurses poked their heads out of patient rooms as she passed. She saw them clock the security escort, the blood on her scrubs, the expression on her face. They watched her walk past them like they were watching a firing squad march past a condemned prisoner. Her locker was in the break room on the second floor. She opened it and began to pack. A cracked ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from some shiftmates 8 months ago who thought they knew her. A dying succulent she'd forgotten to water because she'd been focused on a mission that had just dissolved. A photo in a plastic frame, 14 faces in surgical masks, standing in the 115-degree heat of a forward surgical team in Fallujah, Iraq. 7 of those faces belonged to people who were now dead. One of those faces was the man she'd just saved in Trauma Bay 1. One of those faces was hers. The security officer waited while she packed. Other nurses glanced into the break room, saw what was happening, and looked away. Nobody asked her what happened. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody wanted to be associated with whatever was falling apart in front of them. By 7:30 in the morning, she was outside St. Michael's Medical Center, walking toward the bus stop in the cold Denver rain. The cardboard box felt heavier with each step. The rain soaked through the bottom of the box, dampening the edges, threatening to dissolve the photograph into pulp. She held it tighter, as if holding it tighter could somehow keep it together, could somehow prevent everything from falling apart. The bus shelter smelled like diesel exhaust and wet concrete. She stood under its aluminum roof, watching the rain hammer down on the parking lot with a sound like applause for a performance that had just closed. Behind her, somewhere in this hospital, Sergeant Major Chen was waking from anesthesia. He would remember nothing except that something had happened at 0300, that hands had moved with the precision of muscle memory, that he was alive because someone had refused to let him die. She would never be able to tell him that. Never be able to explain. Never be able to accept the gratitude that rightfully belonged to her, because accepting it would mean admitting that Captain Laura Bennett, United States Marine Corps, had failed her mission. She had gone deep cover to investigate pharmaceutical trafficking. She had been close. She had been weeks away from making arrests, from connecting the supply chain that was fueling insurgent medical operations overseas. And then Sergeant Major Chen had arrived, and she had made a choice, and she had saved his life, and she had burned her entire operational cover to do it. Inside her jacket lining, hidden behind the faded unit patch from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the patch she'd sewn there herself, a talisman from another life, was the only proof she had. A small flash drive no bigger than a thumbnail. Photographs. Documents. Intelligence that would confirm everything she'd told them. Names. Dates. Bank accounts. The truth, encoded into data, locked away where nobody would ever find it unless she revealed it herself. Revealing it would mean admitting failure. Admitting that she'd broken her cover voluntarily. Admitting that she'd chosen one man's life over an entire operational mandate. The Pentagon would understand. Naval intelligence would understand. But understanding and forgiveness are different things, and she'd already made enough choices for one day. The rain kept falling. The bus was late. The cardboard box continued its slow surrender to the weather. And in the hospital behind her, somewhere in the ICU, a man was waking up, alive because a woman in scrubs had remembered her training in Baghdad and performed emergency surgery at 03:15 in the morning in Denver, Colorado, knowing exactly what it would cost her. The machine that had been breathing for Sergeant Major Chen stopped its mechanical rhythm. His eyes opened. Not the confusion of heavy sedation, not the groggy half-awareness of a man still swimming up from anesthesia, but the clear, focused attention of someone who had been trained to assess threats. His hand moved to the oxygen mask. Someone stopped him gently. A Marine colonel stood at the foot of his bed, dress blues immaculate, face carved from the kind of experience that doesn't come from textbooks. Chen's eyes locked on his. And then Chen's lips moved, forming a single word that hung in the Denver morning like a rifle shot: Valkyrie. The colonel went absolutely still. He'd heard that call sign before. Every Marine officer in naval intelligence had heard it. He reached for Chen's chart with the kind of deliberation that comes from understanding something had just shifted. His fingers found the medical history, the intake documents, the surgical reports, and then, there. The citation. His voice dropped to a measured cadence, each word separate and distinct. Navy Cross recipient. Captain Laura Bennett. He paused. Baghdad, 2009. Field medical assistance under fire. 14 lives. Her call sign was Valkyrie. The colonel looked at the patient. At the devastated thoracic cavity that had been repaired by hands trained in a combat hospital. The geometry of it aligned. The precision of it aligned. Everything aligned. She was here. She saved your life. The colonel didn't ask questions. He made phone calls. The kind of calls that don't go through civilian switchboards. Within 68 minutes, not an hour, but 68 minutes, a 2-star general entered St. Michael's through the emergency department, dress uniform immaculate, presence the kind of thing that made the air pressure change when she moved. She didn't check in with administration. She went directly to the ICU. Her aide carried a small metal box retrieved from the parking garage, from the trunk of a 2006 Honda Civic that had been parked in the employee lot for 8 months. The box held the things Laura had locked away, dress blues with the insignia of captain still attached, the shoulder boards, and pinned across the chest, 7 ribbons. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. And centered above them all, the ribbon of the Navy Cross. The general set the box on Chen's bedside table and looked at the patient, then at the chart, then at the security footage the colonel had already pulled from the hospital system. She found Laura in the break room, checking inventory on the narcotics cart with the same mechanical precision she'd maintained for 8 months. The general didn't salute. She waited. And when Laura turned and saw her, the moment stretched like pulled glass. Captain Bennett. I'm General Catherine Morrison, Naval Intelligence Command. We need to talk about Nightingale Protocol. The name of the operation hung in the fluorescent light. Laura set down the chart she'd been holding. Yes, your placement here was operational. Your assignment was to track pharmaceutical diversion through the supply chain. Your cover was complete. So I'm going to ask you directly, why did you blow your cover at 03:15 this morning? Laura's voice didn't waver. He was my sergeant major. The general nodded once, slow and deliberate. The thoracotomy. Field procedure. Combat-grade execution. That wasn't a nurse following protocol. That was a surgeon operating from muscle memory. She paused. You've been here 6 months. 8 months, and you've documented the trafficking. Encrypted files. Ready for prosecution. A Pentagon liaison appeared 2 hours later, a woman with the bearing of someone who regularly moved through military and civilian hierarchies like she owned both. She sat down with Dr. Pierce in the hospital director's office and explained, with surgical precision, that Laura Bennett's placement at St. Michael's had been authorized at the Department of Defense level. That the pharmaceutical investigation was an active federal operation. That the security footage of the emergency thoracotomy was classified evidence in that investigation. Dr. Pierce stood up. His careful documentation, his meticulous paper trail, his 7 months of building a case, none of it mattered. This is fraud, he said. His voice had found its anger now, the kind of fury that comes from realizing the game board was never the board you thought you were playing on. That woman performed an authorized surgery. She violated every scope of practice regulation. I have documentation. We know, the liaison said. We've reviewed your files. They've been very helpful. He left the office at 8:13 a.m. The hospital IT administrator, a man named Rodriguez who'd served 2 tours with the 160th SAW and had a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, watched the security monitors. Watched Pierce access the hospital system at 8:51. Watched him attempt to delete 17 video files from the early morning trauma logs. Rodriguez had already saved every frame. Had already logged the deletion attempt. Had already sent the timestamps to both the hospital board and the federal investigators standing in the command center that the Pentagon had quietly activated in the hospital basement. The next day, Pierce was called to an emergency hospital board meeting. The directors sat in a semicircle, and the liaison from the Pentagon stood at the head of the table with a laptop. She pressed play. The footage was pristine. Every second of it. Laura's hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. The needle going in. The hiss of air escaping. The chest opening like she'd done it 1,000 times before, which she had. Chen's vital signs climbing on the monitor. O2 sat rising. 68, 75. 82, 88. The blood loss controlled. The hemorrhage identified. The bleeding vessel clamped with the kind of confidence that comes from having done exactly this in the dust storms outside Fallujah with artillery falling and a 16-year-old corpsman screaming for more light. And then the footage cut to a different timestamp. 8:08 a.m. Dr. Pierce entering the security office. 8:51 a.m. His fingers on the keyboard. The deletion command. The error message that appeared because Rodriguez had already locked the files. Dr. Pierce accessed the security system this morning and attempted to permanently delete evidence, the liaison said quietly. Under federal law, this constitutes destruction of evidence in a military investigation. This also violates HIPAA regulations, state medical board requirements, and hospital policy. The room didn't move. Didn't breathe. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical complaint overhead. The hospital board pulled every form Pierce had filed against Laura over the preceding 8 months. The pattern was immediate and undeniable. He'd begun targeting her in month 2, after she'd corrected a medication error, a dosing miscalculation on a pediatric patient that could have killed the child. He'd escalated in month 4 after a patient specifically requested her instead of him. He'd filed 3 separate complaints in 1 week after Laura's patient satisfaction scores had exceeded his by 14 percentage points. The state medical board launched an investigation into his pattern of retaliation. They found 4 previous nurses. For women who'd left St. Michael's under circumstances that suddenly looked far less voluntary. One had transferred to a clinic in Wyoming. Another had left healthcare entirely. One had spent 18 months on medical leave for stress-related illness. All of them had crossed Pierce professionally. All of them had been pushed out. The nurses Pierce had poisoned against Laura started talking. Carol, the one who'd been whispering at the vending machine 6 weeks ago, called the investigators herself. He told me she was unstable, Carol said, her voice thin over the phone. Said she'd been fired from her previous hospital for boundary violations. He asked me to watch her. To report back. I believed him. All lies. All documented in the hospital's personnel files. All provable. The pharmaceutical investigation that Laura had been conducting in encrypted files for 8 months was recovered and decrypted. 6 months of meticulous documentation. Supply chain analysis. Medication counts that didn't match records. A trail that led directly to the pharmacy supervisor, and then, buried in the consulting fees for that supervisor's medical practice, payments that included a Dr. Charles Pierce as a minority partner. He'd been profiting from the very theft that Laura was investigating. $240,000 over 18 months. His share came to approximately $47,000. His medical license was suspended that afternoon. He was escorted from St. Michael's by security, the same guard, it happened, who'd removed Laura 6 weeks earlier. His personal belongings were packed into a box, hastily and without ceremony, while the staff of the hospital watched from behind half-closed doors and didn't look away. 6 months passed. Laura Bennett's office at St. Michael's had her actual name on the door now. Captain Laura Bennett, USMC, Special Medical Liaison. The pharmaceutical trafficking case she'd constructed led to 7 arrests, including the pharmacy supervisor and 3 mid-level healthcare administrators who'd been moving product through distribution channels. The case was still being prosecuted. Her operational assignment had concluded successfully. Through her office window, on a Friday afternoon in late October, Laura watched the parking lot. A medical supply van pulled in, white with a red cross on the side, the kind of vehicle that serviced small rural clinics in places that couldn't afford a full-time staff physician. Dr. Pierce loaded boxes into the rear cargo hold. His hands moved with the same precise efficiency they always had, but his face was thinner now. His shoulders carried something different. Not the arrogance of institutional power. Something smaller. He looked up once. Found her watching from the window. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She held his gaze with the same flat, cold stare she'd given him 6 weeks ago at the vending machine, the one that had made him and his whispers stop mid-sentence. She held it until he looked away and climbed into the van's cab. His medical license was permanently restricted now. No hospital privileges. No supervisory authority. No access to controlled substances without oversight. Montana clinic work. Rural medicine. Routine physicals and prescription refills. It was, perhaps, exactly what he deserved, a career reduced to its most basic function, stripped of the prestige and power that had defined him. Laura touched the faded unit patch in her pocket. The one that had been hidden in her jacket lining 6 weeks ago, the only proof of her true identity she'd been allowed to keep. She unfolded it now and pinned it openly to the lanyard holding her military credentials. The emblem of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Fallujah. The names of 23 Marines under her care, stitched into the fabric in tiny lettering that only someone who knew to look for it would see. She could finally wear her real name again. Could finally stand in the hospital corridors without the weight of false identity. Could finally be seen. In the ICU, Sergeant Major Chen was walking the halls with decreasing assistance, his thoracic tube output dropping, his lung expansion visible on X-ray, his voice getting stronger with each day. Laura entered his room for evening rounds. He was sitting up, looking out the window at the October light. "How are you feeling, Sergeant Major?" Chen smiled. It was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Better than I deserve, Captain. I heard what it cost you, staying those 6 hours. Blowing your cover to save me." Laura checked his chest tube output, her hands moving with the same precision they always had. "You'd have done the same. We take care of our own." She updated his chart, noted his vital signs, blood pressure 122/78, heart rate 82, oxygen saturation 97% on minimal support. Everything healing exactly as it should. She paused at the door. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," she said quietly. Chen nodded, understanding in his eyes. The understanding of someone who'd been there. Who'd seen it too. Semper Fi, Valkyrie. Semper Fi. Laura closed the door and continued her rounds down the hallway, no longer invisible, no longer hidden, her footsteps echoing against the tile with the confidence of someone who'd finally stopped pretending. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A patient called for assistance. She answered. The night shift had begun, and Captain Laura Bennett, USMC, was exactly where she needed to be. If you made it this far, you already know that heroes don't always wear medals on their chests. Sometimes they wear scrubs, and sometimes the bravest thing they ever do is simply refuse to disappear. Subscribe for more stories about the ones nobody sees coming. Comment below, would you have saved him or walked away? Like if you believe the ones who've survived the worst are exactly the ones we should trust the most.